So I was listening to a sermon from a fellow United Methodist preacher this past week from Baptism of the Lord Sunday. A few weeks ago, the day that we remembered that we were the beloved, anointed children of God who could always trust in that love, that promise. And during that sermon, Reverend J. Williams from Union United Methodist Church in Boston explained that baptism was like God's washing machine. Unlike back in the day when there were scrubbing boards and entire afternoons spent washing clothes, you don't have to do that anymore. You just put the clothes in the washing machine and an hour or so later, they're done. They're clean. Likewise, in baptism, you don't do much work. God's grace is bestowed on you. You are beloved and you're set. But that doesn't mean that there's not work for you later on. You still gotta hang the clothes or dry the clothes and fold the clothes. Just because the bulk of the work is done for you, just because the hardest part was taken care of, doesn't mean you're off the hook. So today we start folding. Today we find ourselves on the shores of Galilee at dawn, the time of tossed and mended nets, of splashes and weighed down boats, when fishermen are waiting for that school of fish to enter their nets for their daily paycheck to be caught. There's Jesus walking along the shore, and he sees a few pairs of brothers. Maybe they're folks he's met before. I'd imagine they were, since there's no introduction and there and then and there. It's like Jesus knows Simon and Andrew already. These two young guys on their own, entrepreneurs, if you will, making a go at it with their small fishing business. Andrew started off their morning casting a net into the sea, seeing what will bite today. When Jesus calls out, "Follow me." And just like that, they go. Not in a bit, not we'll come in at lunch, not, well, how's that going to affect us, but okay, immediately. They leave their nets, the things that weigh them down, behind them, and they go. Then the merry threesome comes across another set of brothers, James and John, kids still, who are so young that they're still on the shore, working for their dad's operation. And still we see that adverb, immediately. Immediately they left their father Zebedee and the other hired men, and they followed Jesus too. We can rationalize away the immediately all we want. They saw something in Jesus, or that's just Mark's theme. Mark loves the word immediately. Every story starts or concludes with immediately. People are on the run in Mark's gospel. But there's something about Jesus that demands movement, immediate movement, up and at 'em type movement. It's, well, an epiphany, an aha moment. And this season, this epiphany, this aha moment in the church year, when we realize who Jesus was on this earth through all of these stories that we share, this epiphany demands immediacy. It calls for urgency. Epiphany is more like otherwise. Otherwise, epiphany would be more like, well, that's interesting. There wouldn't be any immediately about it. So the disciples drop everything and go. Because of passages like this, I imagine the disciples mostly as pretty young men. Immediacy, spontaneity is much more common the younger you are. And it's important in this episode because preparation is something that comes with responsibility. Responsibility is often something that comes with age. But preparation, it seems, or complication, perhaps, only seems to make faith matters worse. Builds up anticipation and expectations, and then when things don't go as planned, or with time there's a chance to psych yourself out, to listen to that shiver of fear in your ear like we talked about last week, and not exercise that tingle of excitement at the same time. So anyway, we have these two young men on the road, up and moving. Or these two sets of young men with Jesus up and moving. Because that's how they got started, that's how they keep going. Throughout their whole lives, they're moving. They were doing something. And that's the next step in this discipleship pattern we're talking about. Come, follow, do. Once we know and trust in our belovedness as God's children, once we have that mix of excitement and fear that comes with hearing God's voice, we go. We respond. We act. Now, there are a lot of people that we could admire and hold up as saints. There are a lot of people who have an impact on the way we see ourselves, on the way we see our religion, on the way we see our God. People like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Billy Graham, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Pope Francis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Anne Lamott, your grandmother. People who, through their actions, we see Jesus at work. Through their love, we understand the love of God. I know there are a lot of people, and yet this past year, maybe more, there's always one I come back to. Martin Luther King Jr. I know he's one of many, but there are times, years even, when delving into the character of one person can tell you more than skimming the character of many. And I know his holiday was last week, but we're going to talk about him today. See, the more I read and reflect on King, the more amazed I am with his life. The more challenged I am by his words. The more I consider him one of the most Christ-like figures in all of Christian history. I mean, he's certainly a disciple. You see, he was a young man when he started leading the bus boycotts in Montgomery. In fact, Rosa Parks said later that it was a good thing that King was there. He was young enough to be excited. He was young enough to not be tied down, not to have too many connections one way or another to worry about before he started what became the civil rights movement. He was ready to up and go. It's easy, once we're settled, to want to stay comfortable, to stay where we are. But that's not what discipleship is all about. These disciples learned that from the start. Perhaps they originally jumped off the boat, left their dad on the shore for hopes of travel, of meeting new people, of excitement. And they found all those things while they were traveling with Jesus, while they were following Jesus, but that's not all they found. It's probably everything they expected. But sometimes they had to glean fields for food or depend on strangers. They'd get kicked out of places and they'd find themselves in danger. They found themselves on trial. Even the teaching of Jesus, what we'll read later on, wasn't what they'd expected. Instead of just sitting back and reflecting on faith ideas, they would experience their traditional beliefs and practices challenged. They'd find themselves at a banquet seated next to rich businessmen one day, and the next day seated with the poor on a hillside. Jesus told them that the types of people they'd been taught to like or not to like as the case may be, weren't the types of people that God seems to favor. So back to the Reverend Dr. King. You see, Jesus and King didn't let their followers sit around in this warm bubble bath of feelings, just knowing that they're loved. They didn't just sit around the campfire singing Kumbaya. They knew they were beloved children of God. They knew that everyone was beloved children of God. That's what made them get off their behinds, out of the walls of the churches and the temples, to push those who were comfortable beyond themselves. They preached, they acted, they pushed us and our ancestors beyond where we were. They preached and lived out love, violent love, as Oscar Romero called it, love that is uncomfortable and challenging and painful at times, love that stretches from what is to what could be. It's a love that discomforts, disquiets us, love that is frankly so upsetting, so jarring, so off-kilter that they killed them for it. That is what we recognize on Martin Luther King Day. And that is what we worship every day. So often we ignore the difficulties, the challenge, in order to have something nice and comfortable and complacent, frankly, that we can worship and celebrate. I keep thinking about Reverend Dr. King and how every year we have conversations and arguments about race in this country. We argue that marches like those in Milwaukee or Boston are irresponsible for blocking traffic, and then in the same line we celebrate the march in Selma. We talk about how there's no problem anymore. Thank goodness that movement is over and done with. And yet we forget that it wasn't a happy movement. We forget how despised the Reverend Dr. King was during his lifetime, especially towards the end of his lifetime. In 1966, the last year that Gallup polled the country on their opinion of Martin Luther King before he was killed, he had a 32% positive and 63% negative opinion rating. Pardon the term, we've whitewashed King since then. We've made him less of a radical, more of a rule follower. It's why there are debates about his and Johnston's portrayal in the movie Selma right now. Who he is, how he's remembered, varies deeply from person to person. And yet, we all post happy, inspirational sayings of his on Facebook and in our schools, and we proclaim from the pulpit, forgetting how abrasive and how derisive he was as well. Now, King was no saint. He had his problems. He was a human being just like you, just like me, just like all of us. And yet through God's grace, he was able to work that human being who let that line from today, follow me, speak truth to his life. That line, follow me, pushes us beyond what we know, beyond what we hope, beyond what we could wish, into God's reality, into God's future. One that is so much more than any one of us could come up with on our own. But what all of us, were we to actually work together, to actually love each other, to actually get up and go out and change the world into that reality. Now, I know I'm pushing things, but you know what? There's a part of the gospel that's a challenge, and discipleship is that challenge. Discipleship is not just about sitting and know that you're loved. It's about following. It's about getting up and going. And frankly, those of us who are Christian and who are here have been Christian long enough to acknowledge that challenge, not to run away from that challenge. We've been claiming this identity for most of our lives and claiming it for our comfort. And when we do that, that's a sin. And so we have to reclaim this Christianity, reclaim our faith, reclaim the identity of the person who we follow. We have come here to worship our God who was so derisive when he was on this earth that they killed him. Most people did not celebrate him during his day. He had a small band of followers, and since then, we've made him a happy-go-lucky, inspirational quote giver in the past 2,000 years, since that's what people want to hear, and that's how the amount of people who like him has grown. Is this still Jesus' movement? I think it is. Are we still Jesus' followers? I think we are. I know us here. We know God's love. We know we are God's children. But are we like the disciples? Are we willing to drop everything, to challenge ourselves when God says, "Follow me"? Are we willing to move beyond what our world says, beyond the places that we feel comfortable, to the places where Jesus calls us, to those places where we have to depend on God's grace, on God's voice to do amazing things? We can. I know we can. Now, I also know that we have felt down and out, that we have felt like there's not much more we can do, even in our small little towns. But we can. I know we can. I know God is calling us to do great things, if only we'd listen. Augustine, that father of Christian theology, is known to have said that hope has two beautiful daughters: fear, anger, and courage. Anger at how the world is, and courage to move out of our pews and change it. Now, today we have a monetary collection that goes along with all of these things. Today you'll find Human Relations Day envelopes in your bulletin. This is one of the smaller sum special Sundays of our denomination. We're much more likely as a church to give money on World Communion Sunday, when we celebrate our global identity, or at One Great Hour of Sharing, when we give money to UMCOR. Human Relations Day is a challenge for us. You see, it does the same thing that Jesus did, that Martin Luther King did, that same thing that doesn't let us sit around with fuzzies and butterflies and know that we're fine as things are. It pushes us to see the humanity in those that we don't want to. It gives love, it gives absolute full-on action to those that we don't like, those who we were taught not to be, those people who, in the words of that hearsay gospel, don't help themselves. Human Relations Day gives money to rehab facilities for addicts and to homeless shelters for teens. It's the day that we give money to do God's work at that most foundational level for those beloved people that don't know they're beloved. Give money if you can. But, and this is major, that doesn't get us off the hook for doing good, for doing God's work, for changing things in our own community. We should do things at both levels. We should give to the things the denomination already does, because they can do work far greater than we can as individual churches. But we still have to reach out to our own community. We still have to pay attention to the sick and to the poor, to the outcast. Where are the struggles in our community? What can we do? Who can we partner with to do more for our community, to bring God's promises of wholeness into our community? How can we live kindly among friends, among family, among strangers, and show that that's how God is? How can our own faith and our own assumptions be upended by new ideas and new experiences? Follow me, says our God. So let's get to work. Let's get a move on. Amen.